Hey everyone, Charles Moskowitz here. Thank you very much. My guest is Andy Gole. Now, Andy is a sales expert. He's the host of the website Urgency Based Selling. Andy, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here.
You know, Andy, sales is something that I've really never been that good at. I've tried it in different venues. When I lost my job as a radio host, I had to do something. So I got my license to sell life and health insurance. And I just couldn't put it together. I was making about 60 or 70 calls a day, and I would get appointments. I'd get out there, I'd have to return appointments, but I just couldn't quite figure out how to close the deal. And since then, I've noticed that there's a certain type of person who's very good at sales. I'd call them a natural born salesman. That's not me. Is there a natural born salesman, and what are the characteristics of that?
Well, I think I'm kind of like from your school. This stuff didn't come easy or natural to me. And I definitely observe people in the marketplace who are naturals. They just have, that emotional intelligence and likability factor. And I think that gives them a huge edge when they sell. Like the prospect, it encourages the prospect to look for reasons to do business with them. Absolutely. And I came at selling very much from an analytical project management perspective, and I had to really learn how to be more sociable and gregarious, and that didn't come naturally to me. I think that there are different kinds of sales, and when you're selling insurance, and particularly when you're selling individual policies, it's a B2C sale. It's a business to consumer sale. And most of the selling that I've worked on is B2B. Not 100%, but it's mostly B2B, business to business. And when you're in a business to business sale, you more likely have the opportunity to get into a very rational, um, business oriented, what I call business values selling. So a social seller is somebody who wants people to like them, and a business seller wants to earn the right to profitable business. And I think that most people who come in as salespeople, they want, not everybody, but most people want the prospect to like them. And it's not a bad thing if they do, but you're there to do business. And so obviously I wasn't a fly on the wall when you were presenting. Maybe you'll give me some feedback here. But if you were worried about people liking you, that could be a problem, right?
Right.
And then if you really didn't have a high EQ, emotional quotient, that could be an issue. But finally, did you give people a compelling reason uh, to change from the incumbency position, whatever they were doing right now, whether it was a policy they bought from somebody else that they could now buy from you, or they weren't buying at all. They were, in effect, self-insuring the risk. Did you make a compelling enough reason to come with you? Those were all, I think all of those things could be factors.
Well, I think that the obstacles that I had, besides the fact that I tend to be somewhat of an introvert, even though I'm doing this program, is that I tend to be a bit of an egoist in that I'm more interested in selling something to do with me than some kind of an external product that I don't totally believe in or that I can't really get my arms around. And in the case of insurance, I had a lot of trouble relating to it and
Mm,
warming up to it. And I think that, that came across because if you don't, I think if you don't believe in, not only you have to believe in the product that or service that you're selling, but you have to have very, very strong, and well integrated knowledge of it. You have to be the expert. And I didn't really rise to that because I wasn't interested enough in it. And I think that came across. And so if you don't have that, then you come across as basically just a kind of a needy, grasping guy who wants to get a sale. You know what I mean?
I absolutely agree with you. And I probably should have added in my first comments um, the difference between narrow self focus, narrow self interest, which almost everybody could smell a mile away, and becoming or moving towards becoming a trusted advisor. And to the point you were just making, if you don't believe strongly in what you're doing, it's very hard for you to be successful. In the book I wrote, Innovate Now, which is hopefully going to drop September 10th, I talk about a path to achieving emotional intoxication through selling. And the core is moral certainty. You can't go anywhere without moral certainty. So to apply it to the case you were describing, if you didn't believe strongly in what you were doing, you were kind of dead before you started, right? Because ultimately you were going to have contempt for yourself. So a key to success in selling is to be in a place that generates respect and self-respect, respect and self-respect. So self-respect comes, in my view, from being on like the crusade. You're doing something fantastic. The way I see it in a typical company, if you work for a company, you sell for a company, you're on 4 crusades. There's the narrow self-interest. There's the success of the company is the second one. The third one is you're like a knight of the realm, protecting all those people who work for the company who wouldn't have jobs without sales. People who, in this regard, they can't protect themselves because they don't bring in business. And the fourth and perhaps most important crusade is raising the prospect to a higher level of well-being, often, ironically, in the face of his or her resistance. So the core of the selling project, as I see it, is we're trying to sell somebody who has a need and means to pay, and they've had some success. And so they're on a peak in their life, and the problem is they're looking down. If you can imagine in your mind's eye, somebody on a peak, on a mountaintop, looking down, and there's a higher mountain right next to them. But because they're self-absorbed or they just don't know, they're looking down, they're not looking up. And what a successful salesperson does is helps that person look up and notice a higher mountain. This is a metaphor, of course, a higher mountain of well-being. And the irony in this is usually the prospect at the outset is fighting you. Either they're radio silent or they'll tell you, I'm good where I am, I'm good with my solution. And so it's kind of like agony and ecstasy. You have this incredible prospect who you could do good for them, it'll be good for you, and they're not talking to you. And that's the core drama in business development and selling. In order for you to succeed at it, you have to believe strongly in what you do. First, that there is a higher mountain of well-being. And secondly, you could be a Sherpa, like taking somebody up to Mount Everest. You could be a Sherpa taking them to that higher mountain of well-being. And the way we do it is through something that's a jargon word. It's type 3 knowledge. So there are 3 types of knowledge. Type 1 is what you know. Type 2 is what you know you don't know. And type 3 is what you don't realize you don't know. And super salespeople are experts at engaging prospects in conversations about type 3 knowledge, which is going to introduce them to this new possibility, the higher mountain of well-being. And so the essential core thing a salesperson does is take someone who's looking down and getting them to look up and notice an incredible possibility. And that's the core of the crusade. That's the core of why we feel clean and good about what we do. And another way to frame it is salespeople are in the business of opening the closed mind, and that's what moves civilization forward. So I see the kind of salesperson I'm talking to as heroic. He or she is, they're on a mission to make things better. And it's in the face of resistance. Again, the irony being the person you're going to help very often will be rejecting you at the outset.
I mean, it makes me think that in the broad sense, we're not just talking about selling a product or a service, but we could talk about a politician. I mean,
Yes.
I watched the Democratic debate last night. I was thinking each of these people has a particular brand, and they're each presenting a particular concept that they want you to remember and differentiate them from the other people. And they want you to walk away with something that's aspirational and new, and like, hey, that would be great if this country could do that. I relate to that because that describes something that, in a certain way, I'd like to see happen. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, but you talk about the first three pieces of the leg being the company and the people you're saving. The person that you're talking to, they don't care about that. They care about what they're doing.
Absolutely.
So I suppose the first three are things that you have to internalize before you can then begin to develop the fourth thing. And that this idea of the other thing I've noticed that's a similarity with people that I would call natural born salesmen is that they don't shut up. I mean, they have a gift of gab. They can keep a conversation moving, and they can keep kind of putting together the dots. I mean, it's like they string you along piece by piece, and that's a certain skill. I mean, doing a talk show is another kind of a skill because you're not dealing with people directly. You're in a studio and you're talking to people. But this whole conversational thing of keeping somebody moving and keeping them engaged, there's an extraordinary skill, and I've noticed that some people really have that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to give you another way to look at what you described. There's a certain kind of salesperson. I don't think you're really thinking of that person who talks a lot because of insecurity, and they think they're in control when they talk. And in most situations, you're wildly out of control when you're talking, and the only time you're in control is when you're listening. So the person you're describing could be good to start a conversation when there's nothing going. They need to quickly shift, usually to be effective, into fact finding, to discovering the prospect's needs. And it's through asking great questions that we discover the prospect's internal dialogue, the self-talk. What are they really thinking? Because when you're doing all the talking, they could be smiling and nodding at you, and their internal dialogue can be, "Holy cow, how am I going to get this guy out of here? I want to eat lunch, or
That's
I
true.
need I need to take a break here." So they smile at you. The only way you really know their internal dialogue or have a shot at it is when they're talking, which means you need to ask great questions. Now, the salesperson you described, who's just a great raconteur, if they get the job done, they get the job done. But it could be very inefficient if it takes them hours and hours of talking to kind of warm
Mhm.
somebody up. So an important technique for a salesperson is to have a fantastic story. And I can give you an example, maybe
Please.
not fantastic, but that starts in the social bonding realm. And by the end of the story, you're talking business. And to do that in 2 to 3 minutes, that's an important skill.
Well,
And if you'd like an example, I'll tell a quick story.
go right ahead.
Okay. So when I teach, I often open with this story, and then I talk about it as a technique at the same time. So I got started on this life of crime, what I'm doing now, actually back in college with a crisis I faced. Probably a crisis you and your listeners face too. I was going into my last semester, and there was a course I really wanted to take, and it was only offered at 7 a.m., and I slept till 10. So what would you do if you were faced with that crisis? You want to take the course, it's your last hurrah, it's your last chance, and it's offered at 7 and you sleep till 10. What would you do?
I don't know. I'd either tape it or
Okay.
somehow, or
Right.
I'd have to roast myself up.
Right. When I ask this question with a group of people, some people say, "Well, I stay up the graveyard shift. Stay up all night, take the course, go to sleep." All kinds of different things. Take a friend. They'll go one time, you'll go one time. If you were like me, you would have tried to get the university to try to change the time the class is offered so you could
Mhm.
sleep late.
Right.
So imagine you're getting dressed in your dorm room, and you say to yourself, "Am I crazy? I'm bucking the system. We're supposed to do what we're told in life, but not this time, right? You got the appointment, you go, and the tsunami that has started in your stomach, by the time, I mean, the butterflies that have started in your stomach, by the time you get to this administration building, it's like a tsunami. Get this big, imposing administration building, 20 floors high. You ride the elevator to the 20th floor. You have your hand on the professor's door. This is the head of the department, right? You hear the voice coming through the door. You choke with fear for a moment. I mean, isn't it true that there are moments in your life you're on the precipice of doing great things and you choke? Not this time. You push through the door, you're belly to belly with the professor who's the head of the department, and the professor doesn't know why you're there and says, "What can I do for you?" So what do you say? Do you say to this professor, "Do you mind changing the time the class is offered so I could sleep late?" That ain't going to play well. So what do you say? What might you say?
How much you admire the course.
You admire the course. You'd like to take it. But
Yeah.
what's the reason why you should change the time? You got to give them a reason. Going back to your comment before that it's the fourth thing that matters. What's in it for them? So what could possibly be in it for a professor who's the head of a department, not teaching the course, to change the time the class is offered to a later time? What's in it for them?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, maybe it might make the course more appealing to more people. I don't know.
Better attendance.
That's
And what
right.
happens if the attendance falls below a certain level? They cut the class. So
Sure.
that's how you pitch it, right? Now you watch the emotions play over this professor's face. Incredulity that you're the brass, thoughtfulness, finally a big smile. You know what? Let's do it, says the professor. Let's make it noon. By the way, crazy, was I? Differential equations was the class, right? So 6 payoffs to this story. Number one, they changed the class so the time the class was taught so I could sleep late. Fantastic. Number two, I met my wife in college, and in the last 40 plus years, she has said to me many times she regrets the day they changed the class. She thinks wrongly that if they had knocked me on my butt and made me get up at 7 a.m., I would have been easier to manage all these years. Third payoff, 20 years old. What a fantastic lesson. If something is man-made or woman-made, you could change it.
Hmm.
Right? Not gravity, but if it's a rule, you could change it. And then creative out of the box thinking. Go to the head guy. Don't go to the, lower level. Go to the head guy and do or die urgency. These are all things that I learned from this story. And by the way, what am I talking about now? I'm talking about do or die and urgency. And is that important in your business? So
Yeah.
what I have done is I started out with a social bonding story, right? Did you have a problem with a class that was late? And by the time I get to the payoff of the story, I'm now discussing your selling problems. That's an example of a 2-3 minute story that starts you out in the realm of social bonding, you know, just finding common ground, getting to know each other. And 3 minutes later, we're deep into discussing critical issues.
Hmm.
So my recommendation, I teach people this, is you have to have a fantastic opening story because after all, in many, if not most cases, and you may have even experienced this when you sold insurance, you didn't have all the time in the world, right?
Right.
So very often somebody wants you to get to the point and you trespass if you spend too much time socializing. But if you don't spend some time socializing, you don't create that human bond. So
Sure.
what you want is a powerful transitional story. So there's a lesson.
No, I mean, in a way, you made yourself useful to him. And, I've noticed that even like when someone goes in to apply for a job, and I've talked to people on their way to an interview and their resume, and they're worried and they're sweating bullets. In a way, you have to realize, think about it, that the person that you're going to be seeing needs you more than you need him. They advertise the job. They want someone to walk in there to solve a problem. They
Yep.
have a problem. They need something to be done in their office. You're presenting yourself as someone who can solve their problem.
Yep.
And in a way, it's sort of like an inverse of what we would conventionally think is the approach. We think, oh, please buy this. Oh, no, you're doing something that can solve something they're dealing with. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so it's an interesting,
Well, I would even
ju-
take it further. I would say that they're bleeding to death.
okay,
That's the way I look at it. When somebody invites you in, they're bleeding to death. So it's just amping up the vision that you were sharing. Like
good thing to keep in mind when you go to these things, right? I mean, a good
amazing.
visualization. Yeah,
That's the idea. It's to motivate you. Is to now they're not going to make it easy for you. They'll play
right.
some poker. They'll hide their hand. I give you an example. I do some outward bound marketing, and a CEO who owns a company that does about 70 million in sales gave me an at bat. We were on the phone for 10 minutes, and he said, "All right, I'll see you." I asked 28 salespeople, and I don't know at this point if I'm going to close. I think I might. So he invites me in, and we have a meeting, and I keep on sharing ideas and saying, "Do you have this issue? Do you have this issue? And why did you invite me in?" And he's very non-committal. And it almost took a half hour, but he finally said to me, I have to have you talk to my CEO. And he's helped me double sales in the last 2 years. So I said, geez, if you've doubled sales in the last 2 years, why the hell do you need me? I mean, you're doing pretty good on your own.
Yeah.
And he said, well, the problem is we're growing by acquisition. And the core business I started 30 years ago, it isn't growing. It's even declining. And I find it so frustrating. And it took a half hour, but I finally found out why he brought me into the meeting.
Hmm.
So if you use my imagery of he was bleeding to death, he was, but that don't mean he's going to share it with me. He's still going to make me, he's going to make you, the prospect's going to make you go through your paces to show that you're worthy of possibly being a trusted advisor.
So you're really going into the meeting with like a third ear, if you will. It's like what my grandmother used to say, listen with a third ear, view it with a third eye.
Yes,
To sort of try to scope out what it is they really want. And it's not always visible, not always apparent. Sometimes it's pretty well hidden. But
absolutely.
if you calm yourself and listen carefully and just check out the signs and just be in the place, observe, with every bit of your intuition and kind of engage them, in a way that would lean them in the direction. It's likely that it's going to occur to you what's going on and what they really want. And it doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's like a bell goes off and you're like, ah,
Absolutely.
this is the thing.
And there are
So,
things you can do, and I'll then, if you'd like, I'll name some of them. There are things you
sure.
could do to try to make that bell more visible. So, one thing you could do is your research before you come in, if there's a digital footprint,
Right.
because you're you're going to really distinguish yourself if you've done your research and you could talk about the research. So that's something you could do. Another thing you could do, and most people like to respond to it, is ask them to tell you their story.
Yeah.
So with tools like LinkedIn, and I was with somebody the other day, and I said, "Gee, I noticed you started out. You were like a project manager, but you were just doing you were like a draftsman when you started, and now you lead a team of 26 people. That's quite a journey in 15 years. Do you mind telling me the story?" So
Yeah.
with the advent of LinkedIn, it used to be you would have to ask people, can you tell me your story? Now you know what it is going in, and you could start with that. And I've had as much as an hour where prospect talks for an hour. So that's a very deep bonding kind of move if a prospect will share it. And again, you could know this in many of most cases going in. Another thing you're going to do is you're going to show them that you subscribe to the idea of gratitude and earning the right. So here's a way I like to start a meeting when it's a little tentative. I'll say, listen, um, I'd like you to tell you what would make this meeting a success for me, and then ask you what would make it a success for you. So what would make it a success for me is if you're glad you took the meeting. if you felt there were so many takeaways that even if you never talked to me again, even if you never had a reason to buy anything from me, you would say, hey, I'm glad I met with Andy. And I could tell you're going to get fantastic takeaways. And so, I put the burden on myself because if I'm looking in a selling situation, I'm looking for their time. I've got to earn the right to that time. So how do I do that? I do it by saying, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have fantastic takeaways. The next thing that I think is important, and these not necessarily in order, but could be, is you got to be an expert. And you kind of alluded to that in your insurance case earlier. So like I remember I drove out to meet with one client, a prospect rather, who had raised their hand with my marketing and said, come out. And it was a 2-hour drive each way. And it was a market I didn't know. And I'm asking myself as I'm driving there, why the hell am I going on this? Turns out it was a one-call close, which is infrequent in my business. And I just kept on asking a series of questions or making statements and asking questions, which I think showed myself to know something about the space. Like I would say, I find that a big problem in many companies is that the salesperson who is covering the key accounts are not getting introductions. Because after all, that's the super highway to your growth in most B2B businesses, is getting introductions. Do I have a minute to tell a very quick story or I don't?
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
So to illustrate, I'll tell you Sally's story. So Sally works for a company, and this company does about 40 million in sales, and half of their sales goes to a Fortune 100 company. And there are 15 salespeople, but Sally's only job is to cover this Fortune 100 company, and it's half of the company's sales, about 20 million in sales. And so we do this program that goes on for many, many weeks, and we come to the week where the assignment is get an introduction. So then we have a seminar 1 week with a homework assignment. The next week is one-to-one coaching. So we're in the one-to-one coaching, and I say to Sally, so Sally, how did it do getting an introduction? And she said, I didn't get any last week. I said, okay, it's first week of the program. How many people did you ask? Nobody. Oh, really? Hey, Sally, did you know we all had an assignment, all the 15 salespeople, everybody was going to get an introduction? Yeah, I knew. And she's getting a little edge. I said, so tell me what happened. How come you didn't get an introduction? She says, you don't understand, Andy. When I was hired 22 years ago, my job was to wait for that phone to ring. When that phone rings, I go over to the client. I find out what their needs are. I take care of their needs. I come back to the office, and I wait for the phone to ring. I said, Sally, I got it, but here's the problem. You're blocking the superhighway. You're the only person who calls on this Fortune 100 company. If you don't get any introductions, nobody's going to get any introductions. So you have to make an important decision. If you want to stay in this position, and you don't have to, because you're a valuable, member of the team, we could move you elsewhere. You can't block the superhighway. You got to ask for introductions. Well, taking another job would have meant a 1/3 pay cut in pay. Mm-hmm. Can you believe it? 2 weeks later, Sally had an introduction. Now I'll tell this story to this prospect, and I'll say, you don't have that problem, do you? He says, oh my God, do I have that problem on it? And so I go through a series of diagnostics like that, where I know there's a good bet that he or she, the decision maker, has the problem. And I'll say, gee, I'm hoping you don't have that, or I'm hoping, and then they start pouring out. But you got to go first. And so part of being a trusted advisor or moving in that direction is showing the lay of the land. You know the problems, but then demonstrating what's the cure at the same time. So if you've got all these pieces in place, you can really move the ball from who the hell are you and I'm good to, well, maybe I should actually talk to you. So let me just review. You're going to do your research in advance, right? As a matter of fact, I did a call yesterday with a CEO, it was first call, and I started showing him the research I did. And one of them was a personality assessment. I said, it's not always right, but this is what you, and he looks at it and he says, you knew this was right before you came in. So I already had a check mark that I knew how to deal with him, but I'm now going to teach his people how to do it. So do your research, right? Be sure that you come in with an attitude that you have to earn the right. And then what do you do to earn the right? You listen, as you pointed out with the third ear, but some of the questions you ask, like, gee, you have quite an adventure in your life. You started out here, you got here. So that's a very deep bonding move. Show your expertise, show that you know the lay of the land, and ultimately hope you'll get them to answer these two questions. Why did you invite me in? And why now? Because for many salespeople, and I don't know if you had this experience yourself as an insurance salesperson, you could be trying to get an appointment with somebody for a very long period of time,
Oh,
and
yeah.
sometimes years. And sometimes when you'll come in and the prospect opens up and says, the reason I brought you in is my current vendor, they ship late again. And I've had it. And they said, but why now? They've been shipping late for 12 years. I've been calling on you for 15 years. Why now? And there's usually a trigger event, something that broke the camel's back, a straw.
Mhm.
And that's so critical because it helps you monetize the value of what you do for when you get the inevitable answer, your price is too high. So now you make a proposal and they tell you, look, I'd like to buy from you, but don't make me feel stupid. I'm getting it now for $1 and you want $1.50. So you got to know the answer to the question, why now, in order to explain why you're worth the $1.50. So if you do it right, I think there's always an art, but there's a strict science underlying this. If you're checking all those boxes, it's not bulletproof, but you start to stack the deck in your favor. And if everything you do adds 1-2% to the likelihood of closing, and you do all 50, as opposed to winging it. And by the way, the point you made before, very early in the conversation, is so critical. If you don't believe in it, if you don't have enthusiasm, Emerson, I think, said, enthusiasm is the engine of success. If you don't have enthusiasm, this is one thing on which your prospect will absolutely believe you. Like, they will not believe if you say you have the greatest product or service in the world. They ain't believing that. But if you come in with a low energy, low enthusiasm offering, they're going to say to themselves, yep, no reason to talk to Andy. He has no enthusiasm. They're not going to say, Andy, you're not giving yourself half the credit you deserve. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to leave, knock on the door, come back in and do it again. But this time do it with enthusiasm. That ain't going to happen.
Right.
So if you don't believe strongly in what you do, it's very hard to be enthusiastic. The prospect's going to detect that, and you don't have a chance.
No,
So I think there are
absolutely.
things scientifically you could do to up your game, even if you're not a natural born salesperson. Because your natural born salesperson, in my experience, often wings it. He or she doesn't do the research, right? They don't prepare. They could have the enthusiasm, by the way. They don't know how to ask good questions. So I can tell you from personal experience, many times I've beat out the natural born salesperson because I do the process.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, LinkedIn is a very good source. I really recommend it. And good, like, due diligence in terms of the background, and you can get a little bio and an outline of what someone's been through, and put yourself in their shoes and try to visualize what they're doing. So that's amazing. Andy, listen, I want to really thank you for joining me. I am going to be listening to this show back many times. You've really laid it out in a way that I frankly have never heard before, and it's fantastic. And I admire what you're doing.
Can I mention my book before
That's what I was going to ask you. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
please let my listeners and viewers know how they can reach you, how they can get your book, your website. I'm going to post all those things along with the video on YouTube anyway, but please go right ahead.
So people have been telling me for years, if you're so good, where the hell's your book? Well, I don't know that I'm so good. That's another issue. But I did write a book. I'm guilty as charged. It's called Innovate Now. And I don't know if you're
there you go.
This is okay. This is the book.
Very nice.
And it's Scale Up with 16 Breakthrough Sales Techniques. And my idea, following a popular metaphor, is to give people both fish and teach them how to fish. You give a person a fish, you feed them for a day, you teach them how to fish, they could do it for their lives. Correct. So I give what I think are strong selling ideas you can implement immediately with just a little bit of effort. And I've talked about some of them in this discussion today. And then I also give a number of ideas as to how you can create your own ideas in the future, including an induction worksheet that I pulled out of Bacon's New Organon, written in 1620.
Ah,
So my book is now available for pre-order on Amazon.com. It
mhm.
drops live September 10th. I have author copies. If someone's actually dying to get a copy of it, I can make it available. My website is www.urgencybasedselling.net. You could send me an email at andyg@urgencybasedselling.net. And if you want to call me at 201-415-3447. So that's how to reach me.
All right. All right, Andy Gole. Listen, I want to thank you for joining me. It's been great talking with you, and thanks so much.
Thanks for this opportunity. It was a pleasure to join you.
All right.